Hi, Dr. Ron Eglin here with ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core Part 6. And in this part, I'm actually going to cover a lot of the little details that putting this thing together. First, as I was working my way through the application, and I'm going to show you here by running this, as I was working my way through the application and the requirements of the application, which changed, along the route of doing it, I determined that I was not going to be able to keep my users and my domain in a separate context because I needed to have access to the users for specific things that I wanted to do. And what I'll do is I'm going to show you very quickly one of those things and just how I had to get to there. So I'm going to go ahead and log in, and I'm going to look at a materials donation. Well, here's something that's simple. I wanted, instead of showing the user ID here, I wanted to show the email address of the specific user. This was doable, but very challenging if I was going to do this other than putting them both into the same context. But that actually had an entire cascade of things that I wanted to do. So first is let's look at the take the migrations. So let's look at the context is right here. So the application DBContext, one of the things I needed to do was I was going to take everything that was in the other context and migrate it to a single context, which I made application DBContext. I'd already made it so that I switched from a identity user to an application user because I was expanding the fields of the application user. So if I go to application user, you can see that I also inside of the that application user, I have two things. When a donation is requested and when a donation is fulfilled, I want to keep track of who did it, but I also want to be able to display who did it, and I also want to be able to look at individual users and see what requests they've made or what requests they fulfilled. What that did was it necessitated a foreign key constraint between donation request, which means that I needed to add, I already had requests made by user D, but I also needed to add in an application user for that specific user and the fulfilled by user ID, which was already in the request, and now I needed the request fulfilled by user. What that means is I can now create a foreign key between between the request made by user ID and the request fulfilled by user ID. Well, now I've got something that's a little bit more challenging because I've got two foreign key constraints pointing back to the same model, application user, and when that occurred, I needed to specify what which key goes to which. It isn't automatically going to be able to determine it like it did in some of the other examples that I showed you. So when you're using Entity Framework, it can show you, it can determine if you've got a single foreign key, like I showed in video, I think video 5, it can determine which table, which field, and make that foreign key constraint for you. But if there's two pointing at the same table, it's not going to be able to do that. So since both of these are foreign key constraints between application user and donation request, which makes sense. The foreign key constraint is that there's a user that creates the request and a user that fulfills the request, two foreign keys. How do I solve that? I go to my application DBContext and I use this code in onModel creating. I take the builder.entity, the type there is donation request, and I define the one-to-many relationship between the request and the user, those fields in request and the field in user, and I have to do it twice because I have two of them. And I just specifically, I'm very anal about code sometimes, but I wanted to see both of them specifically defined here. So in one of them, I have requests made by user, two donation requests made between the donation request and the user table. And in the other one, it's still a donation request, but it's a request fulfilled by user and the donation request fulfilled. Well, what does that allow me to do? Well, I can get rid of donation requests here. The methodology of the properties that are in the models, which become fields in the database, are the same as in the last video. Only thing is that I have two of them that go to the same table. That's a fairly common thing to do. Okay, so we can get rid of that, and we can now look at what that allows me to do. So what you saw before here in was the index for the donation request. I can show that to you again because it's actually going to make a lot of sense to see it so that you can see what I'm doing in the code here. So as this pops up, I'll bring it up over here, and I hit the list. Oops, I got to make sure I'm logged in. Log in, because I actually have to be logged in to do this. If I go to list, right here where it says email, well, the email is not in request materials, which is the model request materials. It is in the application user. But this index here is going to show you instances of request materials. Okay, I know it seems like a lot, and you might have to go back and forth to understand what I'm doing here. But let's close this, and let's go back and look at what goes on when you see that index. First thing you see is the header, which the header just simply goes out and gets the display name for the model, which is annotations. I don't need annotations here. I could actually explicitly put the code in there, but I'm using annotations. But here is the important part. There are multiple donation requests in the database. So what I need is a for each. The for each is going to go through each donation request, and it's going to display the value that you say to put there. The first, now the item is the model for donation request. It is the fields in donation request. So requested item quantity and request fulfilled and request statement, those are properties in donation request, which means that they're in the model. However, donation materials title is not. But donation materials does exist as a property of donation request. We did that when we designed the foreign key relationship from donation request to donation materials. And it has a property title. So instead of showing the ID, which is a number of the donation request, we actually show the title of the materials. This is the donation materials ID was what would typically show here, but we're going to show the title, which means you have to do donation materials title specifically for those model elements. Down here, there's also there are requests made by user, which is, by the way, a application user object, and the email, which is what I want to show. I want to show the email. I don't want to show the request made by user ID because it doesn't mean anything to the end user. So those foreign key constraints were necessitated by those pieces. To do this, I had to take the application context. I had two of them. I had to collapse them into one. It is doable. You simply take the properties of one, put them in the other, so whichever one you're going to actually make the master, and then you still have to go through and you have to create a migration and update the database. It's doable. That can happen. It's not that very difficult to do. So in my project management console, I was able to do this changing, and then I had to go back though. All these pages that I created that were looking at the donation materials here actually had a references to the other previous context. I had to update them to point to the new context where the data was. How did I do that? I simply changed it from here, from one to the other, and I had to do that in all of the pages that referenced the old context to migrate them to the new one. That was simple to do because I simply did a search for every instance of the old context and made a decision where to move them to the new context. And that's just simply, it wasn't really that hard to do. So I was able to make those changes. Now, a couple other things that I've done here, and I'll actually just kind of show you. One of the things that you need to do is implement security. So where to do that? All right, I've got a little chunk of code right here. This is just on one of the create pages, and it's the create page for request materials. I don't want non-authenticated people getting to that page. So on the onGet, I check to see if they're authenticated, and I redirect them to the index if they're not authenticated. So that way, if they enter the page directly, then they can't get to the page because it's just going to pop them right back to the index. One thing I probably could do is instead of redirecting them to the index, I can redirect them to the login, meaning because they're not authenticated. Now, this if statement is simply at this stage looking to see if the user is authenticated. I could also look to see if they're in a specific role and take an action for redirect if they're not in a specific role. The real magic is right here in the iAction result for the page. I redirect them on the onGet. They don't go anywhere further. They don't get to the page because they're not going to get down to the return page down here. Okay, so that's one thing. I also did some customization, which I showed you of the list, where I'm changing the code to look at what I want to actually display, because displaying numbers for a foreign key ID that points to a number isn't necessarily useful for a user to see in those lists. Okay, so I changed those. So I made some modifications there. What I've shown you here is, one, I have two foreign keys in donation request that point to the same table, the user table. One is the user that made a request, one is the user that fulfilled a request. I went through the process of creating a foreign key, the fields I need for foreign keys in the models, both parts of it, both the application user and the donation request, and then I updated the database to build those foreign keys. But when doing so, I had to go to the context and I had to make a modification because now the automated system can't tell which of those keys is which and what is the relationship. So in my context, so I'm going to bring up the context here, I had to explicitly state that, which I did here with the statement, the builder entity statement. I made customizations to some of the pages based on the foreign key constraints and the accessibility. I think one thing that I will show you is in the create CS HTML, one of the things that happens, let's see if that one is, that one's got the donation materials. Wait, I'm going to do this on the list one, which is down here, actually on index, where you actually see it. When you're actually getting the, and this is the onGet asynchronous, this is when it actually goes and gets the information from the database. I explicitly, because I need to use some fields from the properties, which are another object. So in other words, the donation request needs to show the title of the materials from donation materials, which means that when I'm getting the data that's there, that the data that is the data from that model, I also need to get those data for the list that's in that model. So in other words, donation request contains donation materials. I need a property from donation materials, so I need this include here so that I actually go out and get that donation request, I get that information and bring it to donation request, which I do with this include. Okay. Also, because I'm going to get the emails for the users to display, I got to go out and get both of those too. So I got to do this include here and this include here to get those materials, and I got to convert them to a list asynchronous so that I can then use them over here in the HTML display, because there's donation materials and there's requests made by user, requests fulfilled by users, those two properties of the donation request, which are not primitives, they're not just strings or integers, those are objects that I need to get other properties from. And then I can display them, which I do. So, we've covered a little bit of complex stuff here, but as you can see, we're getting to a full-fledged application that does a lot of customized things that you might need to do. I will continue this based on user requests of how to do things based on a real project, the things that happen in real projects. Good coding, I hope this was useful to you.